So, when you are already done, or when you already know how to count the number of outcomes, or when you've already determined the number of outcomes, now it is time to assign the probabilities. Now, before assigning probabilities, you need to take note of these basic requirements. So there are two basic requirements, regardless of the method that we will be discussing after this, is that these two requirements would always be true or should always be met or achieved, di ba? Regardless unsa na method, kaning duha ka buok basic requirements kay dapat ma-apply ni siya sa tanan methods. First requirement is that the probability assigned to each experimental outcome must be between 0 and 1 inclusively. When we say inclusively, meaning pwede 0, pwede 1. Muna diri imong formula, your 0 is lesser than or equal to your probability, kani probability of experimental outcomes. Muna ipasabot na P, the probability of your experimental outcome. Kana specific na experimental outcome is also lesser than or equal to 1 for all I, where again, E is experimental outcome and PE is its probability. So again, maka-remember mo, balik tato sa definition sa probability. Your probability should only have a range of between 0 and 1. So, regardless of what method, diba? What method, what counting rule ang imuhang gamiton, what method of assigning probability, iyahang probability sa kada experimental outcome should always be between 0 and 1. So, muna ang first major na requirement. Next requirement is that the sum of all experimental outcomes must always equal 1. So, kanin siya. The sum of all experimental outcomes must equal 1. So, ika na siya. Ang total nimo sa katuig mga experimental outcomes is 1 gyud siya per mean. Now, there are 3 methods of assigning probabilities. We have the classical, relative, and the subjective method. So, kani siya akong gimension. So, when we say classical, it is when your assumption is that all probabilities or all experimental outcomes has a probability or they are all equally likely to occur or equally likely outcomes. Meaning, patas ra ang imuhang tanang mga outcomes nga mahitabo. So, meaning, ang imuhang probability sila is equally distributed. So, for example, di ba? Kung kaniya ato ang basihan, if muingon tag equally likely, tananing imove ha, ari lang sa combination. If we say equally likely, di ba? Pila ni kabuok? There are 10. 10 ni kabuok outcomes, di ba? No, 10. These are 10 kabuok. 10 ni kabuok or dara imong combination na ra sa baw. Combination is 10. Now, iyahang probability is if moingon tag under classical, the probability. If we say equally likely, meaning ang result na AB is parehas ra iyang probability nga outcome sa result sa AC and so on and so forth. So, meaning, kani siya, ang iyahang probability is 1 over your N. Muna siya. Na example later on. Then your relative frequency method, of course, you already know how to get your relative frequency method. O, moto siya ang basis nimo sa pag-assign sa imuhang probability. And the next is your subjective method, which is based on judgment. Now, here, classical method, again, as mentioned, all outputs or outcomes have equal chances of happening. Therefore, when you assign a probability, it is simply 1 divided by your n. Meaning, pila kabuk imuhang outcomes, imuhang experiment outcomes. So, in this case, ang experiment there is rolling a die. Now, your sample space, sample space is, again, gi-point out ang mga points. It's 1, 2, 6. Muna yung sample space. Now, to get the probability of each point, meaning na siya 1 out of 6. Nganong 6 man, kay 6 mo kabuk yung sample points. So, kung arita sa to example, again, balik ta ganiha, 10 man kabuk ato ang sample points. Diba? 10 kabuk ato ang sample points. So, meaning the probability niya is 1 over 10. Oh. Now, let's try to check kung ni-follow ba siya sa katong requirement sa ato ang requirement of assigning probability. Now, again, first requirement is that all, or not all, but each sample point should have a value between 0 and 1 inclusively. So, meaning, si sample point AB, iyang value is between ba 0 and 1, which in this case, of course, it is valid. Okay, diba? Iyang probability is a 0.1. So, that requirement is na-achieve siya or complied siya. Now, next requirement is that the sum of all probabilities must equal 1. So, ato aning isum, if isum daw ni nato tanang probabilities, diba? The sum of all experimental outcomes should be equal to 1. So, which is, it is indeed equal to 1. So, meaning, kani siyang nato ang probability or kani siyang experiment is sakto ra imuhang pag-assign or ni valid ra imuhang pag-assign og probabilities because it followed the basic requirements. Now, let's move on to the relative frequency method. So, sa relative frequency method, again, you already know how to get the relative frequency. So, by the name itself nga relative frequency, di ba, kung saan ito pagkuha sa imong relative frequency, it is a frequency of your data or your value divided by the total frequency. So, maora pud na dinhi. So, as you can see here, di ba, naaataka to sa imong mga x values or mga imong mga values, and then this is your frequency. So, kung imuhang kwaon ang ilahang relative frequency, which is, diri ato ang term na is the probability. So, if you are to get the probability, so, it's mainly the frequency of the data or of the x value divided by the total frequency. So, you have here, di ba, ang iyahang probability, 0.10, 0.25, 30, 20, and 0.15. Again, these values, diba, is within 0 and 1. So, check na siya daan sa katong first requirement. Now, second requirement, it's the sum of all these values should equal to 1, which as you can see here, it is indeed equal to 1. Therefore, this assigning of probability is valid or it follows the basic requirement. So, muna to ang relative frequency na method. Now, the last method is the subjective method. So, when economic conditions of a company's circumstances change rapidly, it might be inappropriate to assign probabilities based solely on historical data. So, we can use any data available as well as our experience and intuition, but ultimately, a probability value should express our degree of belief that the experimental outcome will occur. Thus, the best probability estimates often are obtained by combining the estimates from the classical or relative frequency approach with the subjective estimates. Because again, diba, because of uncertainties, it's not always na kung unsa man gani ang nakita nimo na result using your classical or relative method, it's not always that it will really happen, because again, those are just probabilities in real life. Now, if you are someone who is already more experienced and you can already understand the experiment well that you are doing, diba? And you have the knowledge and you will apply professional judgment into assigning probabilities. So, kana siya is under subjective method. So, for example, na diri, Tom and Jody make an offer to purchase a house. So, the experimental outcome is either they accept or they reject the offer. Now, based on Jody's probability estimates, para sa iyaha, there are 80% chance na i-accept while 20% na i-reject. While on Tom's estimate is 60 and 40. Now, as you can see, subjective siya kay lahi-lahi man silang duha. These are based on their own judgment. So, we can say that maybe Judy sees something or diba observe or is thinking of something na or na a factor sa iyang decision of giving a high acceptance probability rate compared to Tom, diba? Or maybe Tom is more conservative. That is why he is thinking that only 60% is accepted, or there is a 60% chance that it will be accepted while 40 is not. So it would depend on the person doing or making the estimates. So that is your subjective method. Now, again, the subjective method still should satisfy the basic requirements. So, if diri sa babaw, dili pwede na si Judy, iyang estimate sa acceptance is naa sa 90, then iyang estimate for rejection is at 20, because of course, ang total niya would not be 1 na. So, still, even if it is in subjective method, even if you are applying the subjective method, you should still observe the two basic requirements. And as I mentioned a while ago, the different probability estimates emphasize the personal nature of the subjective methods. Whoever is making the decision or whoever is making the estimates, na nasa iyaha if unsa ang iyang basis or unsa iyang mga considerations in making such probabilities or estimations.